Hello, it's Trev Tucker again with the second part of my presentation called From Stenoses to Fatigue and Scleroses. At the end of part 1, I had discussed the existence of standing pressure waves in a tube in which there is pulsating fluid flowing, and that fluid comes in this diagram from the right end to the left, finding an obstruction at the left end of the tube. That's the same pulse being reflected back, and then it combines in a way that creates relatively low pressure nodes and then regions of vast fluctuations in pressure, where these pressures can be almost double those in a one-way travel wave, which would travel in an open tube. So I showed that there would be large fluctuations at the blockage end and large fluctuations one wavelength away and large fluctuations at a half wavelength away. I'd like now to carry that basic structure over into the examination of blood flow in an internal jugular vein, which would be one of the important veins draining the blood from the capillary bed of the brain. Now, the blood is more sawtooth-like in its pressure pulse, looking something like this. And in this case, I have one pulse that is flowing from the capillary bed, which is off in the right direction here. It comes out of the drainage end of the capillary bed, which is also called the venule end. It hits, when it travels to the obstruction, it hits the obstruction and is reflected back. I've shown that the size of these waves are a little bit different because perhaps this blockage is not 100%, but 80 or 90%, in which case some of the fluid can escape. But most of it gets reflected back. And what happens with these two waves together is the superposition or the summation of those two waves. So as time goes by, the pressure across that internal jugular vein will look something like this. At the blockage at the valve end, and the valve is the valve that separates the bottom end of the internal jugular vein from the next larger vein into which it flows at the bottom end of the vein, the jugular vein. At that point, there will be large excursions in the pressure, and there will be large excursions in the pressure at the one wavelength distance away, and also at the half wavelength distance away. At these quarter wavelength points, it's not quite nice stationary pressure that one saw with a nice sine wave, but it's fluctuating a little bit. However, it is a lower pressure than what one would see, for example, up here at the venule end, or the capillary drainage end of the capillary bed. Note now that the pressure in this example becomes more acute, or pressure increases, or more hypertensive as one approaches the drainage end of the capillary bed, or the venule end of the capillary bed. So that's the increasing pressure that we see there. Now, there has been observed in MS patients the increase in multiple sclerosis lesions that increase in size and increase in concentration, going in what is referred to often as the counterflow direction. So the flow direction would be this way from right to left. Counterflow would be left to right. So going back up into the venules, there is an increasing pressure gradient. Now, this has been observed by a number of scientists. Dr. Franz Schelling, an Austrian scientist who's looked at this problem for 30 years and has written several books and papers, he's noted that the MS lesions sizes and numbers increase in the blood's counterflow direction. Now, that is completely consistent with hypertension also increasing in that direction. So we find that as we go to higher hypertension, higher pressure, the lesions increase. So there is consistency between the theory of physics and what's observed in MS patients. Let's talk for a moment about the capillary bed. This is the normal situation. No blockages, no obstructions on the outflow side. So the blood flows into the capillary bed. It flows in through an artery, and it's been pumped from the heart. This is after it's come through the lungs, the liver, the kidney, and so on. So that blood is refreshed, it's loaded up with oxygen, other nutrients like glucose or sugar. Then the blood flows into a series, a web of ever finer vessels, until finally into the capillary bed. The capillary bed consists of thousands of tiny, tiny vessels. These vessels are perhaps 1/5 of a human hair in diameter, and the blood to flow through them literally has to flow cell by cell. So these blood cells that are loaded with oxygen, glucose, and so on are now literally scraping against the walls of the capillaries, and by so doing are able to transport those nutrients, oxygen and glucose and so on, transport across the walls under certain circumstances into the brain fluid and enrich the brain fluid. That's the normal situation. Then after coming through the capillary bed, it flows through another web of ever increasing size vessels. These are called the venules, until they flow out down through this internal jugular vein. Now, if we look at the situation in which there is a blockage down here, say it's a thickened valve, so we get an obstruction, and in that case, the blood that's trying to exit, the pulses of blood that are trying to exit, become reflected back, and so they form the summation pressure wave, which I've shown previously has this kind of form. It's got these narrowing nodes, and it's got increased pressure. And if this length is right, if the distance from that blockage to this critical area in the drainage end of the capillary bed, in the venules, if that distance is correct, then we'll have a large pressure across that area. So at this point, the output pressure has increased. However, on the input side, the pressure hasn't changed. What that means is the pressure drop across the capillary bed, it's actually decreased. Similarly, it's going to cause a decrease in the rate of flow of blood through the capillary bed. Now that's very similar to siphoning water from one level to another through a hose. If the drainage end of that hose is raised up, and the flow of the water will slow until ultimately, if the drainage end is at the same height as the intake end, the flow of water will stop altogether. Now, in science, in physics, this is called Darcy's law. So by Darcy's law, if we increase the pressure back here, it's a local hypertensive pressure associated with the reflux pulse. That causes a blood flow to decrease. Darcy's law. Schelling also made a comment in his writings, and this is a quote that says that he saw a striking widening of the venous passageways. He's talking about this end, at the venule end of the capillary bed. The drainage vein, the internal jugular veins, etc., are increasing in their diameter as they get closer to the venules. So what we predict in theory looks like it's being observed in practice. Singh and Zamboni have images that show both these primary and secondary stenoses, so I'll show you this picture. Here is what I've been talking about, internal jugular vein, and right down here, this is about down in the collarbone area, is the thickened valve, and so it's blocked off at that point. Up here, about a quarter wavelength away, is a narrowing, or in medical language, a stenosis. And so this narrowing is consistent with this kind of a narrowing, And indeed, it's been found that if this blockage is cleared by angioplasty, this secondary stenosis goes away all by itself. In fact, there have been cases of angioplasty carried out on this blockage, then a stent being put in this place, and after a period of time, the walls of the vein expanded on their own. They let loose their grip on that stent, and the stent has dropped. So this would provide an explanation for the movement of a stent put in the a place where that stenosis may go away on its own after the blockage is cleared. So what's the impact of the back pressure in the vein on the flow, the blood flow through the capillary bed? The rate of blood flow through the bed is substantially reduced by local high pressure at the drainage end. That's according to Darcy's law. If the amount of blood flowing through the brain of capillary bed is reduced, therefore the amount of oxygen carried is also reduced. If the oxygen amount in the brain blood vessels is reduced, that means the amount that can transfer into the cerebral fluid or the brain fluid from that bed is also substantially reduced. And there is another law or principle that comes from cardiovascular physiology called Fick's law. Is this observed in the real world? Well, yes, it is. The oxygen deficiency, it's in the medical world called hypoxia, that's seen in the brains of MS patients has been reduced. And there's a number of authors who have reported that. Now I have to use this word for this cell. These cells, their function is to repair the insulin or myelin that exists around the nerve channels in the brain. These cells, the oligodendrocytes, have the function of making sure that the myelin remains healthy. They are a repair function. But they are living cells and they begin to die from lack of oxygen. That means they're not able to provide the repair function to the myelin. Is that observed in the real world? Well, yes, it is. Here's a quote from Henderson that says, "Early loss of oligodendrocytes is a prominent feature in tissue bordering rapidly expanding MS lesions." So he also refers to the fact that these lesions are expanding as one moves up into the venule end, the capillary bed. There are other scientists who have made similar observations that the oligodendrocytes become rarer and rarer in MS patients. As a result of the loss of the oligodendrocytes, the myelin deteriorates. Also, the reduction of oxygen and other nutrients that's fed into the brain is associated with fatigue. It's associated with brain fog, and there are a number of scientists who have reported this in their scientific papers. So now what I have done is I have traced through the physics of fluid dynamics a blockage in the vein, ultimately potentially giving rise to patient fatigue and brain fog in a series of linked chain events. This is the end of part 2 of my presentation.